So let's make this a goal to write a comment about every sentence in this paragraph. We're going to focus on this first paragraph. It was still warm in the late afternoon sun, and the city noises came muffled through the trees in the park. Okay, what can we infer about this? It was still warm in the late afternoon sun. Maybe this is spring or summer. The city noises came muffled through the trees in the park. So in a sense, it's removed from. There's a certain peacefulness. It's removed from the noise of city life. She put her book down on the bench, removed her sunglasses, and sighed contentedly. The first thing we can do is ask ourselves, who's she? But the other thing is, she's sighing contentedly. That's an important clue. Okay, so this person at least seems happy. Morton, okay, here we have a name. Morton was reading the Times magazine section. What does that tell you about this person? He's reading the New York Times. Okay, so, maybe they're in a park in New York City. We're not sure about this park in New York. He has one arm flung around her shoulder. Their 3-year-old son, Larry, was playing in the sandbox. A faint breeze fanned her hair softly against her cheek. It sounds kind of idyllic, doesn't it? Idyllic. So an ideal sort of setting. Now notice how we know the names of her husband and her son, but we don't know her name. It was 5:30 of a Sunday afternoon, and the small playground, tucked away in a corner of the park, was all but deserted. What can we say about that sentence? Any clues you can see? Well, again, it's tucked away, so they're again removed from civilization in a way. So removed. The swings and seesaws stood motionless and abandoned. The slides were empty, and only in the sandbox 2 little boys squatted diligently side by side. So diligently, in other words, they're working hard. They're focused on what they're doing. How good this is, she thought. Again, we still don't have a name. We don't know who this woman is. But we know again she's content. How good this is. She almost smiled at her sense of well-being. What's interesting to me about this is the fact that she almost smiles. What stops her from smiling? So why is there this almost smile? They must go out in the sun more often. So we presume that they is this little family of 3. They must go out in the sun more often. Morton was so city pale, cooped up all week inside the gray factory-like university. Well, that's an important clue. University, he is probably a professor, which sort of explains why he's reading the New York Times. Interestingly, though, she's not reading, right? She's keeping an eye on the little boy. So we've got a division of labor here where Dad gets to read, he's the professor, and Mom is watching the boy. She squeezed his arm affectionately. She, still unnamed woman, glanced at Larry, delighting in the little pointed face, frowning in concentration over the tunnel he was digging. Okay, so a couple of adjectives about the woman. She's affectionate, she's delighting, okay? Clearly this sense of well-being. Now, things are going to change here. The other boy suddenly stood up and with a quick, deliberate swing of his chubby arm, threw a spadeful of sand at Larry. Ooh. So now everything changes right here. This is sort of an important development. And notice how the author says deliberate. In other words, this was not an accident. And it just misses Larry's head. It just missed Larry's head. Larry continued digging. The boy remained standing, shovel raised, stolid and impassive. So Larry doesn't notice this. He's, like a little kid, not realizing what's going on around him, just having fun playing. Okay, now that we've finished that opening paragraph, what I want you to do is keep going through this text, annotate it really carefully. Look at each sentence, see what you can figure out from these sentences, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss this. So now that you've finished annotating, let's compare notes. Let's see what kinds of things you annotated and compare those with a couple of suggestions I'll make. So notice that the father of the little boy, notice, and this is sort of an important point, he spits. He's very defiant. He's telling his little kid to throw all you want. And then he says, this here is a public sandbox. Remember how I said before that nothing is by accident in a good story? The use of here suggests something. This here is a public sandbox. That suggests that this man doesn't have a formal education, because that's a form of speech that suggests maybe a lack of knowledge associated with language. People don't say this here is a public sandbox. They would just say this. They know that this means here. Other things to notice on this page is how Morton, the husband, approaches the situation. He's apologizing, and he's reasonable. Okay, the other man is not at all reasonable, and he's pleasant. Okay, and then the man lowers his funnies. Ooh, his funnies. Okay, so that's an old-fashioned way of saying the comics. So, that's a real important, this reveals something about the man's character. Morton is reading the New York Times. The bully is reading comics. So he spits, he reads comics. His speech is uneducated speech. This is a very important sentence. His insolent voice was edged with menace. So menace, a threat. And insolent, he's defiant, he's challenging. He curses too. This story is set, back in the 50s or 60s. And gentlemen would not say a word like hell in front of a lady. That sounds old-fashioned now, but, that's the way it was in the 50s. Let's look at some other things. So here is the next page, and notice something really important here, and I'm going to ask you in the discussion questions to reflect specifically on this paragraph. What is this thing, this layer of something else, something heavy and inescapable? What is this that the mom is suddenly realizing? She felt dimly. It had something to do with her and Morton, something acutely personal, familiar, and important. And then the last couple of paragraphs are, of course, about, this final reaction to the story. And this surprising conclusion where the woman echoes the statements of the bully. Oh my gosh, what has happened to her? Why has there been this transformation? So a couple of comments in general about this story. to think of as you enter the discussion forum is some people see this story as a story of class warfare, a struggle between the classes. What do you think of that? When I raised that with my students last year, they went crazy about this. So many of them agreed with this, and we spent probably a half hour just looking at all the clues in the text that would support this interpretation. Other people view this story, and these people might be called, say, viewing it from a psychoanalytic approach. They viewed it as a struggle between reason and instinct. So Morton being the voice of instinct, Morton being the voice of reason and the other man representing instinct, and the mom is torn between the two. So what do you think of that theory? Do you think there's evidence to support it in the text? So these are questions that I'd like you to reflect on, see what evidence you can find to support one of these interpretations, or maybe you have an entirely different view of the story. And we'll be interested to see what you've got to say on the discussion board. Something else I asked you to do in the week's discussion is to come up with your own question. And these seminar-type questions are open-ended questions. Remember that these questions that help us find meaning are never yes, no. They're never factual questions. They're open-ended. There is no right or no wrong answer to it. For instance, the question, what is this thing that mom realizes? That's a terrific seminar question. There is no right or wrong answer to that. The only right answers are the ones that are based on evidence from the text. Okay, I will now see you in the discussion board.